September 30th, 2022, 3:47 a.m. Ouagadougou woke to the metallic roar of Soviet T-55 tanks on the red dirt streets. Soldiers in faded uniforms occupied strategic points, while radios crackled messages in Moor and French. What few knew at that African dawn was that these were not just a few more disgruntled military men taking power. It was the birth of a phenomenon that would keep Emmanuel Macron awake at night, force Donald Trump to rethink still developing geopolitical strategies, and send shockwaves through the corridors of power from Washington to Beijing. If you want to find out how a young 34-year-old captain managed to defy Emmanuel Macron, influence Donald Trump, and change the global geopolitical game forever, keep watching. This is the story that the great powers don't want you to know. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Ibrahim Traoré was just 34 when his hands first gripped the levers of power in Burkina Faso. A captain in the special forces, the son of a subsistence farmer from the Mouhoun region, he had been educated in the military schools that France itself had established to train trustworthy officers for its regional interests. The irony was not lost on later analysts. The West had created its own nemesis. Behind that young face, marked by the scars typical of someone who grew up in the Sahel, there was a determination forged in real combat against terrorist groups and a strategic vision that no Western analyst could foresee or understand. While Paris quietly celebrated behind the diplomatic scenes the fall of the previous military leader, Paul-Henri Damiba, considered difficult to control by French standards, they did not imagine that they were witnessing the beginning of their own definitive expulsion from the region they had controlled for more than 130 years. They thought they had the game under control, as they always had, says a former senior aide to the French Foreign Ministry, speaking on strict condition of anonymity in a discreet café in Paris's 7th arrondissement. Traoré was seen internally as an impulsive young officer, a product of common military frustrations in the region. No one, absolutely no one, on the Quai d'Orsay took his early anti-French statement seriously. It was described in our initial reports as standard rhetoric of internal accommodation. It was Paris's biggest strategic miscalculation in the last decade, perhaps in the last 3 decades. The first 72 hours after the coup were marked by calculated caution on the part of the international community. The Élysée Palace, following protocols established since the 1960s, kept informal diplomatic channels open through regional intermediaries, betting on a historically successful strategy. Burkina Faso's traditional economic dependence would force any new leader, however nationalist he might initially be, to gradually become more moderate and cooperative. Confidential diplomatic documents later obtained by sources close to the French government reveal that the initial strategy was one of patient containment with gradual pressures. The plan, detailed in internal memos from October 2022, envisaged 3 phases. First, allowing Traoré to consolidate domestic power to gain legitimacy. Second, offering economic incentives conditional on good international conduct. Third, applying targeted pressure through ECOWAS regional partners if necessary. It was a manual that had worked dozens of times since the formal independences of the 1960s. But Ibrahim Traoré had studied exactly that manual, and he had other plans. On October 15, 2022, just 15 days after taking office, the young captain called a press conference at the Kosiam Presidential Palace. Dressed in a simple military uniform, without unnecessary decorations, speaking in fluent French, but with an unmistakably local accent, Traoré made his first statement that would echo through the corridors of Western power like a thunderclap in a clear sky. Burkina Faso will no longer be anyone's backyard. Our sovereignty is not for sale, our dignity is not negotiable, and our independence is not conditional on the approval of foreign powers. The phrase, spoken with the calm of someone who had rehearsed not only the words, but the historic moment, was broadcast live on national television and immediately replicated by Pan-African media channels. Within hours, excerpts of the speech were circulating in dozens of African languages on social media. The international reaction was immediate, but still deeply underestimated. According to European diplomatic sources, The Quai d'Orsay described the statement in internal reports as typical rhetoric of new African leaders in a phase of internal consolidation. A confidential memo from the time, leaked years later, described Traoré as a young officer with predictable populist tendencies, likely to moderate positions when confronted with economic realities. It was October 2022, and France still firmly believed that its centuries-old influence in the Sahel was not only solid, but unshakable. After all, how many African leaders had started with similar rhetoric, only to gradually fall in line with Western expectations when faced with the harsh realities of national budgets and structural dependencies? The first concrete sign that something fundamentally different was happening came exactly 3 weeks after the initial statement. On November 7th, Traoré convened a closed meeting of its kind, unprecedented in its format. Ambassadors from all the ECOWAS economic community of West African states, countries, consular representatives from traditional powers such as France, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and, surprisingly, official delegations from Moscow and Beijing. The meeting, which was supposed to last 2 hours, lasted 7. Local journalists noted unusual activity. Chinese diplomatic vehicles remained parked outside the Kosiam Palace until the early hours. Russian representatives were seen in separate meetings that lasted until the next day. That's when we realized we weren't dealing with a typical coup plotter or a traditional military leader, says a former senior official at the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou, speaking by phone from his current home in Virginia. The bilateral meetings that followed that summit had a structure that suggested advanced planning. Traoré wasn't winging it. He had a detailed plan, a medium-term strategic vision. And that plan, it was clear, did not include the West in a position of command or tutelage. Diplomatic reports from that week, later leaked, showed growing concern but not yet alarm. The term most commonly used was close monitoring of the situation. Meanwhile, 4,500 miles away, in the carpeted corridors of the State Department in Washington, the first detailed reports on Ibrahim Traoré were reaching the desks of regional analysts, and eventually the morning briefings of senior officials. The language was technical and cautious, following standard diplomatic protocol, but the tone betrayed an underlying concern that grew with each new report. Burkina Faso's new leader demonstrates behavioral and decision-making patterns inconsistent with historical profiles of traditional partners in the region. A diplomatic cable from the time, later made public through controlled leaks, detailed. Traoré displays an unusual combination of assertive nationalism, sophisticated strategic planning, and apparent detailed knowledge of regional historical precedents. Unlike previous military leaders in the region, he shows no signs of seeking immediate international validation or approval. In-depth analysis of motivations and long-term objectives is recommended. What none of these seasoned analysts, with decades of experience in African politics, knew was that Ibrahim Traoré was already 3 steps ahead of any Western strategy. He had spent months studying not just the history of Burkina Faso, but the patterns of intervention and control that outside powers had used in the region since the colonial era. In his own words, later revealed in exclusive interviews, "I read every biography of Thomas Sankara that I could find. I studied how he was isolated, how he was overthrown, how his ideas were stifled. But I also studied Lumumba, Nkrumah, all the African leaders who tried independent paths. And I learned from their mistakes as much as from their successes." Traoré's intellectual preparation was just one aspect of a much broader strategy that was about to unfold. December 2022. While the world focused on the World Cup in Qatar and the first economic consequences of the war in Ukraine, Ibrahim Traoré was taking the first concrete steps toward the geopolitical revolution that would forever change the balance of power in West Africa. And no one, absolutely no one, was paying enough attention. January 2023. While the world remained mesmerized by developments in the war in Ukraine, by the growing tensions between the United States and China in the Pacific, and by the unfolding of a European energy crisis, Ibrahim Traoré was quietly executing one of the most audacious and calculated geopolitical moves of the decade on the African continent. The first piece of the chessboard was moved during a seemingly routine and formal meeting with the Nanims, traditional leaders of the Mossi people, Burkina Faso's majority ethnic group, representing approximately 52% of the national population. The meeting, held at the Ouagadougou Palace following centuries-old rituals, appeared to be standard internal diplomacy, the kind of symbolic gestures that new leaders make to secure traditional legitimacy. But what appeared to be a formal courtesy was, in fact, the first move in a meticulously planned continental strategy. Traoré understood something that many African leaders took decades to grasp or never fully grasped, explains Dr. Amadou Ba, an expert on African international relations and Sahel geopolitics at the Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, who is considered one of the most respected voices in regional political analysis. He understood that the true strength of an African leader comes not from pleasing or satisfying external powers, but from creating a solid internal base, real, not just formal, popular legitimacy, and then gradually expanding into unexpected and non-traditional regional alliances. During that meeting with traditional leaders, which stretched over 3 days instead of the 2 hours originally planned, Traoré not only secured domestic support, he presented a vision of Burkina Faso that resonates with deep concepts of Mossi cosmology, autonomy, collective dignity, and resistance to destabilizing external forces. It was brilliant, says Rasmain Ouedraogo, a political anthropologist specializing in Burkinabe traditional structures. Traoré spoke the language of the ancestors while presenting a thoroughly modern vision of national sovereignty. He managed to translate complex geopolitical concepts into terms that made sense within the traditional worldview. The Nanims not only approved of his policies, they saw them as a natural continuation of the Mossi people's historic resistance to outside invaders. The second strategic move came in February 2023 and was much more visible internationally. Burkina Faso has officially announced the expulsion of French Ambassador Luc Holade, a veteran diplomat with 23 years of experience in African postings. The decision was publicly presented as a direct response to unacceptable neo-colonial interference and attempts at political tutelage incompatible with our national sovereignty. But the ambassador's expulsion was just the visible tip of a much more massive and complex geopolitical iceberg. Diplomatic documents later leaked through regional investigative channels revealed that on the very day of his official expulsion, February 14, 2023, Traoré had established direct and secret channels of military and economic communication with Bamako, the capital of Mali, and Niamey, the capital of Niger. The communications did not go through traditional diplomatic structures or existing regional organizations such as ECOWAS. The goal was crystal clear: to form an entirely new military, economic, and political alliance that could operate completely independently of traditional structures controlled directly or indirectly by the West. Emmanuel Macron's reaction was swift and followed exactly the historical script that France has used in the region for decades: immediate and coordinated economic pressure. Within 48 hours, France officially suspended all development aid, canceled military cooperation programs, and signaled through informal diplomatic channels that French companies should re-evaluate investments in Burkina Faso. It was a move that had worked virtually automatically dozens of times in the region since the 1960s. The logic was simple and historically effective. Without French economic support, Sahel countries faced fiscal crises that forced leaders to back down from nationalist positions and seek reconciliation with Paris. This time, it was completely different. The big fundamental difference between Traoré and other African leaders who have tried similar policies is that he was expecting exactly this reaction, said a high-level source close to the Burkinabe presidential office, speaking on condition of anonymity during a meeting at a neutral hotel in Accra, Ghana. He had prepared concrete and detailed economic alternatives months before making any political decision that would anger Paris. It was not impulsiveness, it was long-term strategic planning. These economic alternatives had very specific names and partnerships already in advanced negotiation: Russia and China. In March 2023, Russian delegations began arriving discreetly in Ouagadougou on flights outside regular business hours. Officially, they were consultants on security and military capabilities development. In practice, these were the first operational steps in a strategic partnership that would completely change the balance of power not only in Burkina Faso, but in the entire Sahel region. The Russian consultants were not just military. The delegation included economists specializing in mineral resources, rural infrastructure experts, and communications systems technicians. It was a comprehensive approach that contrasted sharply with the historically narrow focus of French cooperation. At the same time, trade agreements with Chinese state-owned companies began to be negotiated at a rapid pace. The strategic focus was clear: transport infrastructure and mining, precisely the two sectors where France had historically maintained near-monopolistic control since the colonial era. China offered something that France had never offered in its 130-year presence: real technology transfer and local capacity building, explains Dr. Li Wei, an expert on China-Africa relations at Peking University. It wasn't just conditional loans or humanitarian aid. It was technical partnerships that allowed Burkina Faso to develop its own capabilities. The Western response was a surprising mix of incredulity, followed by controlled, but still uncoordinated panic. American diplomatic cables from a time, later revealed through leaks organized by regional WikiLeaks-type platforms, clearly show the growing tone of concern in Washington. Traoré is implementing what appears to be a coordinated and systematic strategy of accelerated de-Westernization. The pattern differs significantly from historical regional precedents. Urgent and coordinated diplomatic intervention with European partners is recommended before the model spreads to other countries in the region with military governments or populations dissatisfied with the status quo. But by the time Washington and Paris finally began coordinating responses, it was already significantly too late. The Traoré pattern was spreading at geometric speed. In April 2023, Niger, under military leadership since the July 2023 coup led by General Abdourahmane Tiani, announced decisions almost identical to those of Burkina Faso: expulsion of French diplomats, suspension of traditional military agreements, and opening direct negotiations with Moscow and Beijing. Mali, already estranged from France since the 2021 military takeover, has dramatically strengthened bilateral ties with Burkina Faso. Government delegations have begun moving between Bamako and Ouagadougou with unprecedented frequency. What had begun as a localized change of government in a country of 22 million people was rapidly turning into a regional geopolitical revolution with continental and global implications. It was precisely in this context of accelerated changes that Donald Trump, already actively preparing his presidential campaign for 2024 and seeking political differentiation in relation to the Biden administration, made a completely unexpected statement that took both Democrats and Republicans by complete surprise. During an exclusive interview at Mar-a-Lago in May 2023, Trump stated without warning, "It may be time to completely rethink our traditional approach to Africa. Some of these new leaders may have valid points about national sovereignty. We can't keep doing the same things and expecting different results." The casual but clearly deliberate statement caused immediate consternation in European diplomatic circles and strategic confusion in Washington. Was Trump signaling a possible fundamental shift in American foreign policy toward Africa? Was it electoral positioning or genuine strategic thinking? The timing could not have been more significant. Trump made the statement exactly 1 week after intelligence reports showed that Chinese influence in Africa had grown by 340% in direct investment over the past 2 years, while the American presence remained stagnant. Ibrahim Traoré, demonstrating once again his ability to capitalize on geopolitical opportunities, did not waste a single second. Exactly 2 weeks after Trump's statement, Burkina Faso announced through official diplomatic channels an opening for pragmatic and mutually respectful dialogue with all international partners willing to recognize and respect our unconditional national sovereignty. It was a veiled diplomatic invitation, but also a test. And everyone was watching to see who would respond first and how. The move put the Biden administration in a diplomatically delicate position. Ignoring the invitation could be construed as imperial arrogance, but responding positively could be seen as validation of Trump's criticism of democratic foreign policy. Emmanuel Macron, for his part, faced an even more complex dilemma. Any French response would inevitably be interpreted through the lens of decades of colonial and neo-colonial domination in the region. Diplomatic escalation, June 2023. The situation was clearly spiraling out of control of traditional Western strategies. Traoré had managed to turn a local government change into a global case study in national sovereignty and real versus formal decolonization. Most importantly, he was winning in the arena of public opinion, both regionally and internationally. Opinion polls conducted by the Afrobarometer Institute showed that 73% of Burkina Faso's population supported Traoré's foreign policies, a higher approval rating than any Burkinabe leader had achieved in the previous 2 decades. But the true measure of Traoré's success came from an unexpected source: global social media. Hashtags related to Traoré's policies, hashtag Burkina Libre, hashtag African Sovereignty, hashtag Traorvision, began trending globally on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, not just in African countries, but in African diaspora communities in the Americas and Europe, and surprisingly, among young activists in developing countries in Asia and Latin America. Traoré has become a global symbol of anti-imperialist resistance for an entire generation of young people who have grown up seeing the consequences of neoliberalism, said Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid, an expert on global social movements at the London School of Economics. He articulates aspirations that transcend national borders. The Western world was beginning to realize that it was not dealing with just another African military leader. I was facing a generational phenomenon with implications that went far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. September 2023. Exactly 1 year after taking power in circumstances that many international observers still considered transitory and unstable, Ibrahim Traoré was about to execute the strategic move that would definitively transform his international image from young African coup plotter to continental leader with a long-term geopolitical vision. The move came in the form of a diplomatic summit completely unprecedented in the modern history of West Africa. The official announcement of the Alliance of Sahel States (CES), a political, military, and economic confederation formally bringing together Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in a framework of cooperation that would operate parallel to, and, when necessary, in direct opposition to traditional regional organizations such as ECOWAS. But what appeared to be just another African regional organization, the continent already had dozens of them, was, in fact, a formal declaration of geopolitical independence from the power structures established since the Cold War. For the first time in decades, 3 strategically located African countries have come together institutionally without seeking prior permission, validation, or approval from Paris, Washington, Brussels, or any other Western capital, said Jean-Baptiste Nkolo, a senior expert on African politics at the Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and the author of 6 books on decolonization in sub-Saharan Africa. It was exactly the scenario of sovereign contagion that Western powers have systematically tried to avoid and suppress since the formal independences of the 1960s. The AES launch ceremony, held simultaneously in the 3 capitals via satellite link, was broadcast live on more than 40 African television channels and had an estimated audience of 180 million viewers across the continent, figures that rivaled continental sporting events. Traoré, speaking last in the protocol sequence, but clearly recognized as the intellectual leader of the initiative, gave a 27-minute speech that would later be translated into 23 African languages and replicated millions of times on digital platforms. Today, we are not creating an alliance against someone else. We are creating an alliance for ourselves. For decades, we were taught that our strength came from pleasing external powers. Today we have discovered that our true strength comes from respecting each other and working together toward goals that we ourselves define. The international reaction was immediate, coordinated, and revealed the level of panic that the initiative had caused in Western power centers. Emmanuel Macron has called an extraordinary emergency meeting of the presidents and prime ministers of the ECOWAS countries still diplomatically aligned with France, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Benin, and Togo. The meeting, held via secure video conference from the Élysée Palace, had a clearly articulated objective: to isolate the new alliance economically and diplomatically through coordinated regional pressures and to force government changes through induced political instability. The plan was sophisticated and followed destabilization playbooks that had worked before, using ECOWAS to impose heavy economic sanctions, mobilizing regional religious leaders to morally criticize the military governments, and coordinating with international organizations to question the legitimacy of the three governments. At the same time, Washington activated all available diplomatic channels to try to divide the alliance internally through the classic carrot and stick strategy, offering substantial economic incentives to the first country that publicly left the group, while applying specific pressures to the other two. The CIA produced detailed analyses identifying potential fault lines between the three leaders and developed strategies to exploit personal, regional, or ideological differences that could be amplified to cause internal divisions. None of the traditional tactics worked as expected. What the Western establishment failed to understand, and this was made clear in subsequent intelligence reports, is that Traoré had built a base of domestic popular legitimacy that no Burkinabe leader had achieved in the past 4 decades, explains Fatoumata Ouedraogo, a senior political scientist at the University of Ouagadougou and author of extensive studies on public opinion in West Africa. Every external pressure, every attempt at isolation, every criticism from Paris or Washington only reinforced and validated his central narrative of anti-colonial resistance. It was a positive feedback loop for Traoré. The more external pressure, the more internal support he received. Public opinion polls at the time confirmed this analysis unequivocally. In October 2023, just 1 month after the launch of the AES, surveys conducted by 3 different organizations showed impressive approval ratings. 78% of the Burkinabe population fully supported Traoré's foreign policy, 71% considered the alliance with Mali and Niger, very positive 84% said they were proud of the country's international positions, 69% said Burkina Faso was heading in the right direction. These were statistically unprecedented numbers in the country's modern political history, and contrasted dramatically with approval ratings of Western democratic leaders at the same time. By October 2023, the situation had escalated to a level of open confrontation that surprised even seasoned observers of African international relations. France has taken the most drastic strategic decision in its relations with sub-Saharan Africa since the formal independence of its former colonies. It has officially announced the unilateral and immediate end of all military cooperation agreements with the 3 AES countries. This included withdrawal of all French troops from the region, cancellation of military training programs, suspension of supply of equipment and intelligence, closure of French military bases, termination of joint anti-terrorist operations. It was the final move in the French diplomatic military arsenal. Without European military support, the 3 governments would quickly fall due to the combined pressure of jihadist groups active in the region, internal political instability, and growing international isolation. It was a high-risk gamble based on the premise that African leaders always needed external military tutelage to stay in power. Ibrahim Traoré responded exactly 48 hours later with an announcement that echoed not only across the African continent, but through third-world communities globally. Africa does not need armed guardians to defend itself. We defend our land with our own hands, our own courage, our own intelligence. And then he did something that absolutely no one, neither allies nor adversaries, had foreseen. He called for a voluntary national popular mobilization for civil defense. The announcement was made during a national television and radio broadcast that interrupted regular programming. Traoré, speaking directly to the cameras without a teleprompt, said, "We call on every Burkinabe between the ages of 18 and 45 who wants to defend our sovereignty to volunteer in the next 7 days for basic training in civil and territorial defense." What happened next surprised even the organizers. In 1 week, more than 2.1 million Burkinabes, approximately 35% of the eligible adult population, have volunteered. If this analysis has made you think differently about power, sovereignty, and leadership in the 21st century, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Traoré's story is just beginning, and you need to follow every move of this silent revolution that is changing the world. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. See you in the next episode.